Curtis? Welcome, and thank you all for joining Argano and Veracent today. We're thrilled to have you here and have prepared an insightful discussion for you all. Before we dive in, let's cover a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available for you to review afterwards. Please keep your microphones muted throughout the entire session. And finally, if you have any questions, feel free to submit them using the Q&A function. We'll address them at the end. Now, let's get started and welcome our speakers. Dave?
Hi. Thanks, Ola. Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Dave Kohary. I am the head of advisory services and customer success here at Argano. So happy to have the opportunity to speak with Curtis today and all of you that decided to attend. Curtis?
Yes, and hello. Really excited to be with you as well. If we hadn't had a chance to meet, my name is Curtis Schroeder. I lead the research and insight function at Veracent, which is an SPM software vendor. But really, my job is to help revenue leaders build data-informed strategies and help them drive growth. So my focus is on using research to help make sense of what's happening inside our businesses and what's happening inside our organizations so that we can design smarter go-to-market strategies. So I could talk all day about these things. I'm really excited to get to share with Dave and with the rest of the team today as well.
I'm super excited. I know Curtis and I have been looking forward to this conversation for some time now. So let's go and jump into it. All right. So we'll start off by saying, hey, it's the most wonderful time of the year, right? Everybody? No, not the one that you're probably thinking of. It's actually planning and modeling season, and I think it's almost been 1 year exactly since I did a webinar last year with one of Curtis's colleagues, Hunter from Veracent, and another colleague, George from Revenue Shift. But we were talking about this sort of same thing, right? Because it feels like it's an annual exercise that we all go through, and if you think about it. If you're in a calendar year model, maybe sometime back in July or August, your CEO and CFO, they sat down with the board, tried to figure out, okay, like what are we going to do next year, top line revenue, profitability wise, hopefully using some sort of intelligent algorithm to come up with that. Sometimes it's just gut instinct, let's be honest with each other. But at some point along the way, once that starts to, the dust starts to settle from that, then the CFO has to sit down and figure out, sort of step two, what are we going to pay for this, right? Like, what's the compensation cost to sale and the cost to sale, and how much are we willing to spend to achieve those great objectives and high-level goals that the CEO and the board have laid out for us. And then beyond that, once all of that is sort of solidified, they hand off this information to the CRO and the CPO and say, here you go, here's the overall targets and here's our expectation. Go figure this out, right? And, as we all know, there's a lot of this in that this, right? There's go-to-market strategy and alignment and territory optimization and quota setting and plan design and modeling. And it's all kind of running concurrently because as we all know, that there's a lot of interdependencies between that planning exercise and that modeling exercise. And ultimately, finally, when you've got this figured out, then you got to go sell it to your go-to-market organization, right? So you got to go communicate it and roll it out and enable the teams. And by the way, that's just the go-to-market side. Then from an operational perspective, we got to make sure, starting Jan 1, we're ready to hit the ground running, to calculate and pay and provide transparency. And we all know this is exactly how this process works, right? It's a perfect timeline with perfect boxes and perfectly sequential steps along the way. And I think, we're going to hear Curtis talk about just how close to the mark we are here in a second, because he's got a lot of great and interesting data to share with us based on the survey that Veracent did. But I think before we do that, let's hear from everyone that decided to join us. So we have a couple of poll questions that we want to put out there, and we're going to tee those up now. So the first one is, and we're going to use quarters because we realize many of you are probably on a fiscal year, not a calendar year. So instead of months, we'll just say, like, which quarter do you start this planning and modeling process? So we'll give you a second here to respond.
And as the votes are coming in, it's the most wonderful time of the year. I feel like there's an untapped market here for planning process, music genre, and decor that we can bring out of our attics to mark the timing. So maybe that's another area where we approach after this here, Dave.
I had a jacket that I was going to wear that was covered in sort of seasonal, festive accoutrement, but I decided to go with a sweater instead. But maybe next year, Curtis, will
quick access to calculators and pencils and sheets of paper and that sort of thing. Yeah,
exactly. I think I'm not seeing results. Are you seeing any results on the survey, or maybe I'm looking?
Not on my side yet.
So there may be some sort of functional issue, Ola, with the polling process. So,
but I'll tell you, Dave, we asked this question in some of the survey data that I'll get at in just a little bit as well. And what I'm finding over time is that translates earlier and earlier in the process for most companies. So where we might have started at the beginning of Q4 in years past, that it's bumping into Q3, it's bumping even into the early parts of Q2. So that planning process is really not a one-time shot anymore. It's happening earlier and earlier for sure.
Yeah, I think that's good to hear, right? Because I think I was curious to see what the audience would say, because I think anecdotally through conversations I'm having with customers, I think it aligns with what you're saying, but there's still, I still run into the folks that are like, hey, we're doing it in Q4, sorry, or even some that are like, we're doing it in Q1. But I think it's great to hear, more and more we're seeing kind of reality line up to perhaps some of the things that we hope will happen. Let's see, I'm being told there is a way to check the polling results, but we're gonna start the second poll now, which is, actually we had 10 people vote all in Q3. All right, amazing, complete alignment that everyone that answered all started that process in Q3. So, okay, so let's try it again. We're gonna say, which of these best describes how aligned your teams are during the annual sales planning process? So, we'll wait to see how these votes come in.
Kind of like Christmas morning, you get to see kind of like what's under the tree as people start to make their votes.
Real time, right?
Right.
Even sort of spread at this moment. Okay, all right, here we go.
I've joined you again, team. I think we've got the issue sorted. Apologies for that.
Thank you, Ola. Appreciate it.
Well, somebody has full cross-functional alignment end to end, and I want to know that individual. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Seems like you've got it all worked out. That's fantastic.
That person needs to email us after the presentation and let us know who they are. All right. Well, what do you think? As these
later in the process, reacting to changes, aligned on goals but diverging on the plans. Yeah, that's a lot of what we see too, for sure.
Yeah, agreed. I think we were hoping, but not expecting someone to answer A, right? So we're glad to see one person did, but definitely a lot more as probably we expected in some of these other areas where you have some misalignment or some late starts to this process. All right. So with that, I would say, I'm a big fan of this TV show called The Good Place. So I don't know if anyone, Curtis, you and I have talked about it, or if anyone in the webinar today has seen this, but it's fantastic. I've been watching it with my daughter, and I don't want to spoil it for anyone. So I encourage you to go out and watch it, especially if you're interested in moral philosophy, which I know you all are. You can't wait to go check that out. But in The Good Place, in the show, there's this idea of the Jeremy Bearimy, and this is actually how time is experienced in The Good Place, right? So it's not a linear, it's sort of this crazy loops back on itself, and there's a weird random dot over the eye that's disconnected from the rest of it. And when I saw this, I thought to myself, wow, what a perfect kind of analogy for how I actually think this process unfolds in a lot of organizations, right? Like, it's not linear. It's a, sort of looping, crazy process that loops back on itself. And, if you're lucky, we threw those same process steps on here. Maybe the CEO meets with the board, but then you go through a bunch of like iterations and loop backs, and then the CFO sets the cost of sale target. And I love like that little dot is where 3 happens, where all of like the quota setting and and everything else. And ultimately, at some point, hopefully, you communicate all of this out, right? And I think to me, again, it was kind of a perfect analogy for how I think about this process for a lot of organizations. It's not pretty boxes, ending up sequentially and linearly. It's this kind of crazy, loopy, non-linear experience. And I guess, with that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to Curtis. Curtis, I think we'd love to hear more about like what Verascent did and the analysis and the survey that you conducted and how it kind of ties back perhaps to the Jeremy Bearimy example that we're pointing out.
Yeah, for sure. So I put it in the chat. I had to Google The Good Place and Jeremy Bearimy to figure out what that meant, but it really made a lot of sense once Google AI unpacked it for me a little bit. So, but I guess for me the takeaway is I think about the study that we conducted, which I'll share more about, was that if this process feels a bit chaotic, for those that are listening, you're probably not alone, right? That's almost become the normal way of thinking, and sometimes that's I find also where the most creative and most necessary solutions start to emerge. And so when I think about this, we just wrapped up one of the largest market studies in sales performance management. We surveyed over 1,400 executives and revenue leaders, revenue operations professionals, frontline salespeople, and we talked a lot about what's holding back growth in their organizations. And naturally, there was plenty of concerns about the classic disruptors, the things you would expect to be in there: AI transformation, shrinking budgets, economic headwinds, all those things. But the big twist in it was that wasn't really what the main headline in our data were showing. And so what came through loud and clear as we started getting to the analysis is that the biggest threat to growth as we talked to these revenue leaders weren't just the external things. A lot of it was what's happening internally, what's happening inside of our organization. So we see strategy that gets stuck or diluted once it moves from kind of that planning stage into execution, or our teams are drifting or competing with one another instead of collaborating, or the incentive plans that we have are motivating the exact behaviors we don't want from our sellers, or even internally amongst our internal business teams. And so we heard this narrative that leaders are repeatedly talking about how the best intentions, how the most clever plans kind of unravel in the daily reality of our cross-functional silos and misaligned goals. And so that's a study that we'll certainly make available to anybody that's interested, but I do want to get into a little bit more of what we found. And there were 5 chapters within it, but a couple that I'll focus on today. The first one was this idea of internal alignment, or maybe I should say internal misalignment. And so when we talk and heard about internal misalignment in our research, we were describing when that idea of strategy and planning and execution don't seem to move in sync. And we're thinking about that across functions or at those seams or those intersections that happen between teams. And you see it start to play itself out when we think about the core go-to-market activities, things like segmentation and scoring, and we're evaluating our sales team capacity, and we're setting territories and assigning quotas, and we're thinking about training and development, all those kinds of things that can absolutely go sideways when teams are slightly out of phase with one another's. And then if we know that those are the processes, but the symptoms that we feel are probably really familiar too. So we feel the effects of the bad handoffs. We feel the effect of the delays and the frustration that comes from, I needed this on Monday and I wasn't getting it till Friday. Or even a lot of times we heard about the conflicting KPIs that are used internally to measure progress and to measure effectiveness, those kinds of things. It's just all these kind of fumbled handoffs, fumbled handshakes that frustrate our sellers, they frustrate our leaders, they frustrate our operating teams. And then we step back and say, well, why is our progress so slow? Why aren't we able to get things out on time? Why aren't we moving as fast as we want to? And so there's a huge impact to this, even though it is kind of the standard operating model. And so we've tried to dig into that a little bit more. And so we asked the revenue leaders in our study to put a number on the cost of misalignment. And 92% of them said that they are losing material revenue every year because their teams and their strategies aren't fully in sync inside their organization. And we broke that down. We don't have it all listed here, but I think 8% thought it was 1 to 2% of their annual revenue. 16% thought it was 3 to 5%. 40%, the largest chunk, thought it was 6 to 10%. And then there was another 20, 30% that thought it was even more than 10% of revenue. And for a $500 million company, you're talking about tens of millions of dollars less on the table potentially. Even $1 million, even 2 million of left on the table is worth acting on, right? So when we saw this, I was like, man, those are big numbers. Then I expected to see more urgent action. Like, well, what are they doing to solve for this? What are they actually doing about it? But what we started to see was that most leaders know the costs of these things, but they struggle to get traction on fixing the root problem. And it's not always this lack of awareness. It's actually the challenge of how do you coordinate and focus and prioritize the change that needs to take place. And so when we asked them if they were actively addressing misalignment, only 1 in 5 of those same leaders said, yes, we are doing something intentional to deal with that. And so I started calling this the misalignment gap, because we're seeing that most leaders know that they're leaking revenue because teams are pulling in different directions, but very few of them are actually investing the time or the resources to fix it. And so this is a classic example of kind of the broader narrative that we report on in this study. We call it the status quo trap, because it's things like this where the pain is super visible, the costs are very even quantifiable, even perceptually, right? But without some sort of catalyst, many organizations are kind of defaulting just to tackling symptoms, or we add technology on, we do some more training or whatever it is, rather than thinking about how do we fix the internal system. So Dave, let me pitch it back to you. If misalignment, if this is true, if that's so widely recognized, why do you think it's so hard for organizations to make it a priority rather than just something that we acknowledge and move on from?
Yeah, I remember distinctly when I saw this and how incredibly it jumped out like this misalignment jumped out at me when I saw the report. But I also remember thinking to myself sort of instinctively, I get it, right? I understand why to some degree why they're not tackling it, because it aligns with the conversations that we're having with leaders across the business. And if you think about all of the things that you were pointing out that are important in those go-to-market processes, in many organizations today, still they're owned by different parts and different leaders, across the organization. And so getting all of those people together in a room to get alignment, it's hard, right? And often, I think to your point, this sort of status quo is I stay in my lane, I focus on the things that I conceivably are within my remit and I can control, because I fear broadening the table and inviting other people to have a seat just introduces complexity and introduces things that I can't control, and I don't like that. I don't like losing sort of span of control over this problem. I think the other thing too, and you and I were talking about this, some of it is just tenure too, right? At the end of the day, if you think about what is the average tenure of a revenue leader in a new organization? Yes. It's not that long, right? You're talking maybe 18 months, 24 months. And so I think there's a tendency to want to focus on the things that, again, you can control, you feel like you have a sort of more immediate impact on, and creating sort of cross-functional alignment, I think, falls off of that list, unfortunately, pretty quickly, even though the evidence is clear, the impact is tremendous, right?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to talk more about this in just a little bit, but the other thing I wanted to bring up, Dave, too, from our data was kind of a second one of our chapters that talked about another one of the status quo traps that a lot of organizations are falling into, and I called it the quota illusion. And really, it was based on the premise that the quota, these KPIs that we use like quota, are the kind of go-to benchmarks, the performance scorecards that we use in the sales world, right? These are the things that's clear, it's visible, it's what we plan our number for every year. It's what we compensate on, whether you hit this number or not. It's what most of us that have carried a bag have grown up chasing. Like this is kind of the utopian thing that we're trying to seek after. But if you really start to dig through this, I don't know that I ever spent any time in my career thinking as deeply as I had about quota until I started doing this. But when we started to look beneath the surface, it's pretty complicated when you think about what quota is the weight that it's carrying for what it actually is. Is it a good representation of performance on our team? Is it a fair number? Is it where did it come from? Is it the fact that we hit a number last year and we just bumped it up by 10%? Like the why and the what of all of it, you kind of go like, man, we're basing putting a lot of weight in this KPI as kind of the Valhalla of KPIs for our sales organization. And I think we saw some of that. So I mentioned that we surveyed, 1,400 individuals for this. A good chunk of that, I think 400 or 500 of them were actually frontline salespeople as well. And so to kind of give a different lens on this, we asked them about quota and how they perceived it and try to get some insights around that. And 16% of the sellers that we talked to believe that their quota was fair or equitable, so a pretty low amount. 20% think it matches the potential of their territory, and only 13% said they actually understand how their quota was set. Now, I think you can look at these numbers and go, well, of course, every salesperson's gonna, think that their quota is not fair, and that I should have had a lower quota, and I should have more potential in my territory, yada yada yada, all those kinds of things. But if we actually look at the heart behind this, and I think what kind of the signal through the noise a little bit is that if the metrics that we're using feel unfair, or they feel disempowering, or they feel unclear, that can be a big warning flag for us as leaders as well. And it kind of goes back to that theme that we've talked about around internal misalignment, that this isn't necessarily just about the numbers themselves, but it's about how those numbers are built, how they're shared, how they're understood in the organization. And so there's certainly a call for better transparency or better data, a more complete view of performance. But the quota has become, in many cases, an area of frustration and not the tool for growth or a friction point that we want. So let me stop there too, Dave. How does this resonate with your experience? Have you heard some of these things from salespeople or from leaders as well?
Yeah, it's funny that you said it, and you're right on the mark, right? Like expecting members of our teams and organizations that are paid to be creative, sort of arguers. I'm not surprised in some ways to see that like 1 in 5 of them thinks it's fair and the rest think it's unfair. But I think it underscores something again, that we. The thing I like about this data and sort of the insights that you guys are providing is like now we're starting to actually capture data-driven support of things we've understood kind of anecdotally through conversations with customers for years, which is true, right? Like I remember throughout the years seeing different types of survey results, and consistently when you survey sellers, and this ties into some themes we'll talk about later, very often my plan is broken, or the calculation is wrong, is low down the list of the things they care about, right? What's high on the list always is I don't think my manager is great, right? So I'm not getting enough support from my manager. And second or first, those two swap each other, is my quota is unfair, right? Or I don't know how it got set. And I think part of it, and we'll talk about this too, like part of it is absolutely what you said, right? Like, how do we create more kind of transparency into how we're coming up with these numbers? Because they are the ultimate yardstick, right? To your point, in every organization I've ever been in, attainment, we dissect and look at quota attainment, in 100 different ways to try to understand sales performance. But it's striking that if that number, right, if that denominator in that evaluation is wrong, then we're basically basing a lot of analysis on some pretty, like on a shaky foundation. And so I love that this sort of aligns again with what we've known and what we're seeing. And I also think there's like a technology impediment that's existed historically to this too, right? Like if you think about our pretty little boxes on the slide, rollout is like 1 month tacked on to the end
Yep.
of this process. And so when you start to see that compression, it speaks back to this misalignment that we've been talking about. Is like, I'm reluctant to involve more constituents in setting the goals, because that's going to make it more complicated, elongate the process, create even more compression, at the end of this process when I have to roll out. And I just think historically the tooling hasn't been there to even allow people to think like, oh, we could open this up more broadly and create an environment where more transparency into how these goals are being set is offered or disseminated out to the organization. So
that's right. And hey, I just realized that in the copy paste of building our slide here, I must have missed that the right chart here doesn't have the right headlines. So just to be clear, thanks Cindy for calling that out. But it's the question here was, how I believe that I understand how my quota was set. So that's one that's saying that only 13% of people believe they understand clearly how the numbers were set, how they were established, that sort of thing. So hopefully that provides a little bit of clarity. Thanks for calling that out. But
Cindy, you're paying attention. I love it. So
that actually, yeah, I was going to say that's an Easter egg we just left in there to make sure people were paying attention. So we'll call it an intentional design choice on our part, right? I'm good with that. Well, hi Dave. Let me wrap this just by saying there's a lot that we found in this data, a lot that we found in the research that was super interesting, super compelling. We'll make that report available to anybody that wants it for sure. But at the end of the day, what we are finding and what I feel like is worth talking more about is that how quickly misalignment and outdated processes and the way that we approach this planning just slips under the radar. It's a slow build for any organization, but the need for it more regularly, even more frequently throughout the year, it's not going to be a one and done kind of thing anymore. When you have a COVID that hits, or you introduce a new product, or you have to regrettably downsize your sales organization to some extent. Like, we've got all of these inflection points that happen throughout the year that invariably affect our ability and our need to plan. And so it's not really about this one big fix, but about finding and addressing those points of friction before they become baked into our processes, and trying to understand and do that more. So Dave, with that, knowing that these challenges are common, they seem to be resonating, tell us more about how we go about addressing it.
All right. Well, I think to do that, we have to have a little bit of a history lesson. And so we're going to go back 150,000 years, Curtis. We're going to talk about how human civilization, where we started doing hunting and gathering. And then
you dug deep into the literature here, didn't you, Dave?
Yeah. And then, we invented farming 10,000 years ago, and now we have hunters and farmers, right? And then the industrial revolution comes along, and computational. And because every single presentation, there's a mandatory AI component that we have, that we're by law now, I think, required to insert. Here's your obligatory AI reference, where we now are in the age of AI, right? Only kidding, right? Like, we're not going to go back 150,000 years to talk about sales performance management. But I will tell you, spoiler alert, they were using Excel even back then. But there is an evolution, I think, within sales performance management over the last 25 years that's worth discussing, because I think it has a lot of relevance to this conversation, Curtis, that you and I have been having. And I want to talk about that in a couple different dimensions, right? So one is, let's look at historically what has happened in terms of capabilities and platforms from a sales performance management, or SPM, perspective. And then the other dimension is going to be sort of direction and ownership. And there's a couple of areas that we'll drill into there. So with that as kind of the background, let's go ahead and jump into it. So for anyone that's seen me present or seen an Argano presentation, this sort of conceptual framework is going to look very familiar, right? If you think about sales performance management as a program, generally it has three kind of main areas, at least from our perspective. There's planning, which we've been talking a lot about, right? Sales planning, territory planning, account segmentation, quota setting, comp plan design, expense budgeting, analysis, all of these things, right? That are sort of that planning exercise, planning and modeling exercise. And the outcomes of that we have to communicate out to the go-to-market organization. So as a seller, I know, here's my target, here's my territory, here's how I'm gonna get paid. Then there's the execution piece of this, right? The execution is truly fundamentally incentive compensation management. So this is like making sure I connect to the data and do the crediting, make sure the right people get credit and calculate and put money into a person's checking account and give them reports so they understand transparently. And it creates trust. Like, I understand the calculation. I understand why I got paid this way. Plus, to your point, Curtis, like all of the ongoing data maintenance that has to take place, right? Like, we don't live in a world, unfortunately, most of us, that's static, where once a year we make a plan and that plan just, carries forward seamlessly, year over year. Things change. We have to adapt. People come into the organization, leave the organization, competitive situations, whatever that is. We have to manage all that data and keep modifying it because it forms the foundation for that ICM process. And then finally, analysis, right? Now I have planning and execution data. How do I leverage that for insights, participant performance, team performance, often against quota, as we were talking about, or plan and program performance. And of course, again, obligatory AI reference, like, how do we leverage sort of AI and analytics to basically make better decisions about this program and ultimately about the business. So
yeah, when I look at this, Dave, too, I always have this distinction between sales performance management as a technology, as a provider of sales performance management solutions, and also what is happening to manage the performance of our sales organization, right? And I think what I love about this is I think we recognize that there's no silver bullet. I say this kind of tongue in cheek sometimes, that there's no technology that's going to solve for bad process. But connecting this back to misalignment, it's happening. We see the disconnects between these areas because of organizational design issues and the kind of friction that we were talking about earlier. And so I think what I love about looking at this and the evolution of the technology and the evolution of the way that we talk about a program like this is that we're starting to see the inherent connectivity between related processes that sometimes we're solving for despite our organizational design challenges. We know that the incentives are directly connected to the territories that we assign and the quotas that we set. They're all related, things like that. And so technology kind of gives us the opportunity to rethink our workflows and the connection between people, process, and data, and kind of identify where the value lies between all of these things as well.
I think it's exactly right. And if you think about like this sort of historical perspective on this, I've been in this space for about 25 years, which is by no means a coincidence why I wanted to go 25 years back. But, like I was, at the beginning, and 25 years ago, this would have been a one circle chart, right? It was execution. That was the only thing we were doing. We were trying to figure out, like, how do we do incentive compensation management better? And it was all on premise too, right? So like after a few years though, we had, some data probably sitting in an on-premise database, Oracle or Sybase database at a customer. But, I call that analysis 1.0, where we're like, oh, we have some of this data, we can start looking at it and making some observations. And then SaaS comes along and sort of knocks all of the infrastructure pieces off the table. And suddenly now we have a lot of execution data across a bunch of customers. And that led us to sort of analysis 2.0. We're like, oh, now we can start to look across customers and start to, see, like, compare these results. And I think 15 years ago, planning really entered the picture, right? So suddenly you had like a conversation emerging around like territory optimization and goal setting and sales planning, and really organizations like Vericent starting to pull all of this together. To your point, from a capabilities and platform perspective, I can start to do all of these things in one place on a unified platform, which means I have all of this data sitting together, which means now that analysis piece really starts to create a comprehensive picture of all sales performance management. And I would argue, again, AI, just to insert it one more time in this conversation, it's going to change, like it's sitting on top of this data now, right? So, and it's going to change not just operationally the people that are like operating and supporting these processes, but also the frontline sellers. As we start to see, and I know Vericent has a vision for this as well, as we start to see these capabilities mature, I think we truly, it's dangerous to say, but I think we're kind of in the golden age of SPM, Curtis. I think we're like finally sort of reaching some sort of nirvana state where we have all of these pieces in place, and we finally have these tools to start really truly taking a stab at analyzing this in a comprehensive way. Okay, so that's the capabilities and platform discussion. let's switch gears and talk a little bit about revenue and operation sort of direction and ownership. So I want to talk about this again in two dimensions. We'll start with the revenue conversation first. So if you think about, again, I'm going to sort of personalize this. I have spent quite a bit of time, in addition to consulting, in like various professional services and customer success roles for software companies. So I'm going to use a little bit of a software, spin on this. But if you go back again 25 years ago, you had VP of sales, let's call it version 1, right? And this person had a bunch of hunters / farmers running around, hybrid role, trying to acquire new logos and then managing those accounts. But let's be honest, at least in the software world, it was a perpetual license model, right? So like that hunter farmer got a huge upfront check from the customer and then wasn't doing much farming. They were on to the next, they were doing more hunting than farming. And there wasn't, customer success wasn't a thing. Like, who cares about making it successful and operating and getting value out of it? I got all your money up front or most of it, and I'm on to the next. So version 2, though, is, and again, let's be clear, this was not because they wanted to, this is because we were all universally forced to. Version 2, we now have to have customer success because now we're in the SaaS world, and now there's a thing called a contract renewal, and suddenly I don't have all your money up front. I got to fight for those dollars at every contract renewal. So now I need both, right? I need sales, which is focused on, probably hunting mostly, but maybe has some account management, still some account management function. But I need customer success. I need this part of the organization that's focused on value, that's making sure that we're going to get that renewal. And that's sort of version 2. And I think really that brings us to sort of the end state, or at least the current sort of point in maturation on this side, which is CRO, Chief Revenue Officer, right? Like this sort of recognition that all of this, any revenue facing or revenue touching customer facing function probably needs to have unified leadership, unified strategy, unified, sort of perspective. And I think, if you look at all of the data, and I'm curious to get your thoughts too on this, like more and more, this sort of chief revenue officer role is becoming more and more prominent, and we're seeing it cross industry in a lot of places become more and more the norm, where all of these functions are sort of being brought into single leadership. So I guess I'll pause there. Curtis, thoughts? Does that resonate? Is that what you're saying too?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I think if you look even just the last 5 years, how roles and titles and these boundaries keep evolving, like who owns that SPM agenda, how these the ownership pieces, there certainly is a functional part of it, and there's a career development aspect of it, like how are we creating new pathways for leadership and those sorts of things. But I'll also say that it's positive in that the CRO or the RevOps role versus sales ops roles, it's more symbolic of this need for alignment. I think it is the attempt to some extent to kind of fix the organizational design challenges that we've encountered over the last decades that we kind of designed our way into, where we don't have centralized leadership. And so when you can get the transitions right, not just in movement to a new title, but the functional transitions of the business processes to have shared accountability and ownership, that really is the difference between a smooth go-to-market engine and one that stalls out on you when you need it to as much, right? So that ownership clarity matters more probably now than ever, I would say.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, to your point on the operations side, when I started doing this 25 years ago, 9 times out of 10, I was talking to, a chief people officer, right? Like the person, it was an HR conversation, both honestly from a design perspective and a modeling perspective, but also operationally, right? Like the thought was, well, comp is HR. And so, like a lot of the operational teams supporting actually the ICM piece of it would, still report up through the human resources or people office. And I think a few years in, after some high profile stories in the news, people started to realize, there's actually a pretty important audit piece of this that we need to be concerned with, which sort of naturally lend itself more to kind of the finance office. So then more and more I was talking to CFOs, there was sort of this understanding like HR probably still doing the design, but now operationally finance is leading the charge in terms of supporting, the payment and calculation process. And then I think sales operations was born out of like a hybrid of sales and finance, right? If I think about sales operations, a sales operations leader sort of has is like the heart of, or I should say, the brain of a financial analyst, but the heart of a sales rep, right? Like combined together into, a hybrid person that can do both. Because I need to start, like this was sort of a recognition that, hey, we need to be managing sales, not just sort of intuitively and from through a human lens, but also like with rigor and pipeline forecasting and processes and all the things we needed to wrap around that. And I think that's also transformed a bit in recent years into this revenue operations role, which again, I think is a further alignment with the CRO kind of, so both of these things are happening, right? Like revenue is kind of getting consolidated under a single leader. Operations is sort of starting to get consolidated under a single leader. And I know many of you on the phone are probably thinking to yourself like, okay, great, Dave, but I don't live in this world, right? I don't have a CRO and I don't have a head of revenue operations and I haven't like organizationally pulled all of this stuff into one place. And that's okay, right? Because like Curtis said, this is not just about like creating necessarily these organizational structures, but building alignment between the constituents that you do have to start making sure you're having the right conversations. And so I think where we'd like to go next is to walk you through like what are some of those conversations looking like with customers, right? And what are some of the things that we've been discussing with them. Before I do that, Curtis, any like final thoughts on sort of this conceptually, like this evolution that we've seen together over time towards consolidated revenue and revenue operations functions?
No, just kind of what I said before, that I think getting the transition right and also being willing to start small, even if you don't have all the resources that you need to fully reorganize your organization, like there are ways to do for that. And I think that's some of the things you're going to be chatting about.
Sounds good. All right. So let's very quickly, we're going to take you through a couple examples. And I would say just as a foundation, one point that I'll make is, when we come in from an Argonaut perspective and have advisory type conversations with customers, it generally follows a similar workflow or sort of phased approach, right? We start with an assessment. We got to figure out like, where are you today? And what are the challenges you're facing? Inevitably, through that exercise, we identify, areas where technology or process improvement you could benefit from that. So there's some selection exercise where we go through to figure out like, okay, what pieces are we going to focus on and how are we going to solve those sort of discrete areas of focus. And then we build a roadmap, right? We say, okay, like now that we know and we've laid all these sort of pieces out, what's the right order of operations to approach kind of tackling them? Because most of the time you're not going to big bang something, you're going to sort of, to Curtis's earlier point, you got to intelligently sort of think about how do you sequence and move towards that end goal. So a couple of like specific examples. One is over the last year, we started conversations with a global telecommunications company. Primarily started that discussion through the CPO, right? So HR owns incentives. They brought us in, and as we were talking to the CPO and the HR team, the initial sort of thought, their self-assessment was, we think we have kind of an incentives challenge, but one thing that's really been plaguing us is we are now the de facto reporting team for all quota attainment across the company. And of course, we were like, well, that's interesting. Do you set the quotas? They're like, no. Like,
just report on it.
Do you have visibility into how they're set? No. We just inherit this data because we need it, obviously, for calculation purposes. But because we are now that data store, everyone across the company is coming to us with these reporting and analysis requests, and we're an HR operations team. Like, we're not built or sized to have a remit as a global reporting arm. And so through that conversation, we're like, well, who does own this? The CFO and resources in the finance office. So we had to broaden the conversation immediately, bring those people in, have conversations with them. And essentially what the assessment ultimately identified for us was like, hey, you don't have necessarily just an incentives problem. There's some things that we can fix there, but you do have a planning problem, right? And we need to really sort of dig into like how are you setting those goals? And so as we migrated more into like the solutioning and selection piece of this, we've started to create momentum and interest in like, can we solve this planning problem? And then figure out how to solve maybe some of the subsequent incentives and execution and eventually analysis pieces. And that's where we are, right? Like now we're in conversations with Vericent and the customer around this, building this roadmap, which has like planning as a phase one. So bringing all of these sort of disparate finance teams into at least one platform to start setting goals. And then phase two, sort of replacing their legacy ICM solution. But really the ultimate brass ring is phase three, is like, now we have all this data in one place. HR team is no longer the intersection reporting team. Like now we can serve up this information to all of the constituents that are interested in it. And we don't have to, worry about, the HR team being overwhelmed with all of these requests. So that's sort of one specific example. I think the other one was, or is a conversation that's unfolding with a North American healthcare company. This one, we came into the discussion through their sales operations and CRO, and quickly kind of expanded to the CPO and HR team. And in this case, it was an existing Vericent customer. They had already had incentives for some time, and they were using it for a single business unit. But eventually, we were able to sort of broaden again sort of the aperture of what we were looking at, to take a look at what they were doing in a couple other business units where they didn't have technology in place, get the sales operations and CRO excited about like the planning capabilities that were associated with this. And really, like where we are now is, building that roadmap to enhancing what they have from an ICM incentives perspective, but also planning as phase two and eventually analysis. And to me, kind of the key themes here are like, oftentimes we'll come into a complex organization and they'll say like, we have this problem. But then like, as you start to discuss with them and the executives, you realize actually it's a broader problem. It's often not an incentives problem, it's upstream. And I think, sort of the punchline that I often come away with is less and less, Curtis, it's a calculator problem, and more it's a planning and goal setting problem, right? And I think that's representative of all the things that we've talked about already. Like we've got the right people interested in solving the problem. We've got the technology that can help us solve the problem. We're finally at a point where we're starting to, have all of the tools and all of the things aligned to have that discussion.
Yeah, you're right.
Okay, so let's sort of start to land the plane here if we can, Curtis. So I think, like if you think about revenue operations at the center of like all of these conversations, which I think is a theme that we've laid out for everyone today, managing kind of that CEO, CFO goals and budgets discussion, managing, potentially the CRO and CPO comp and capacity conversation. But again, I don't look at this necessarily as like you have to organizationally create this. It's a concept and it's aspirational, right? So as long, you don't necessarily need just revenue operations as an entity, you need to drive these discussions and bring these intersections and create this connective tissue between all of these different teams. I think the other thing that I'd love for you to touch on, Curtis, if you will, is like, how do we measure, like, how are you guys thinking about like, how do we measure success, or how do we measure an improvement? And what are some of the things we should focus on from a KPI perspective when you're going through this exercise?
Yeah, and this is another part of that chapter about the quota illusion. I'll hit it here just kind of quickly, and we can always go back, if somebody wants to read the report and hear more about it. But it kind of in that spirit of centralized revenue operations, thinking a little bit differently about kind of shared metrics and KPIs. A theme kept surfacing, of course, that quota is central, but it's not enough for understanding performance, right? Like that's what we kind of talked about earlier a little bit. And so what we tried to do is I've started to explore some different KPIs and some different ways of thinking. And these are not like transformative types things, but oftentimes things you can do with data that you already have. And one of them was this idea on the top here, the idea of like, instead of looking at total quota attainment, look at median attainment and team distribution as well as kind of a starting point. And so instead of just looking at averages, looking at totals, you can start to get a better sense of how your typical sales reps are performing, and not just that your top 10% are carrying the number and we think all is well, but really we can't scale or adapt or adjust. And so something like this, where you can actually look like, what's our median attainment? Maybe there's a plus or minus 5% around that. You see that kind of shaded gray bar. we go like, well, how many of our reps are kind of falling in around that, or where do we have this kind of wonky, skewed performance curve that kind of that sits in here? And so you can start to spot risk and breakdowns before they hit our P&Ls. The second one on the bottom is one that I'm really starting to love more and more. With all the territory data that we have today, all this kind of focus on quota, there is a potential in looking at kind of the equity ratios between those two things, because in the spirit of alignment, all these things should be very, very well connected. And so if we actually look at what we're using to define a territory, the potential of a territory, and comparing that to the quota that we're setting, you can kind of start to get a visualization across these two axes, for example, where, how do our ratios for each of our sales reps kind of fall within or outside of this boundary of a reasonable ratio between what we're assigning and what we're actually giving them in terms of potential. And that's good on both sides. For a rep that is over assigned in their territory, you're going to be leaving meat on the bone in terms of what they can individually accomplish. And so there's probably potential being unrealized. And then on the other side of it, if we're giving them a huge quota without much territory, there's some problems there too. But there's some data points like this start to speak to centralization, alignment, and just thinking a little bit differently with some of the data that we have.
No, I love this. To me, I think you and I, there's some of us out there that are true SPM data nerds. So thinking about how do we actually start to quantify this and go after it is fantastic. I think in the spirit of that too, Chris, at Argano, we're really starting to think about revenue transformation as sort of this broader discussion, right? I think we've already talked today about SPM should be a broader discussion. Well, as you might imagine, it gets even broader than that. And really, if you think about sort of end-to-end revenue transformation, it involves all of the things that we've talked about today, whether it's sales planning or how do you communicate that out to the organization, how do you manage incentives, how do you do modeling around that? So all of these pieces and the ongoing changes that you have to manage. But interspersed with that is obviously the seller experience itself, right? It's how are you managing your day-to-day activity in CRM, and how are you configuring and pricing and quoting with customers? And what is the right intersection of sort of sales performance management and how do we introduce that into the day-to-day lives of sellers and sales managers? So this is kind of a conceptual framework that we've been building, obviously plugging Vericent, our partner Vericent, in, you guys in where it makes absolute sense and where you have expertise and sort of platform capability that can really drive to optimization in those areas. And along those lines, if you're interested, you'll see in the upper corner of the webinar this register for workshop button. And that workshop really is an opportunity, if you're interested, to have Argano come in and have this conversation with you, right? Let's understand where are you from an SPM perspective, a CRM, architecturally, what do you have set up inside your organizations? And the outcome of that would really be, kind of a couple of work streams. One where we could really dig into that SPM side of things and help build out that roadmap that could include obviously Vericent implementation and enablement and support, but also the CRM and CPQ and financial aspects too, because all of it, again, at the end of the day, from a revenue leader or a revenue operations perspective, you're probably interested in all of those things. So we want to really take a hard look at how all of those things intersect and how they fit together. And you think about the outcomes, and obviously we'll share this material, coming out of that workshop, really you should have a very good idea of what does that future state look like from an architectural perspective, as well as Curtis and I have said, what are the right kind of intelligent phases for how you would approach moving from kind of where you are today in terms of SPM and revenue sophistication to where you want to get to. So, all right, with that, we're going to bring our structured remarks to a close and open it up to hopefully, Ola, if we have time, some Q&A. I think we have a few minutes where the audience can ask Curtis and I some questions. But before that, I wanted to just say thank you, Curtis. I loved today's conversation, as well as all the preparation that we did going into it. As always, you brought some really insightful information to the discussion. So thanks very much.
Yeah, we love working with Argano for sure, and a lot of great work to be done with companies just like those that are on the call with us today. So appreciate the opportunity.
All right.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Curtis. Great session. If anybody has any questions they'd like to ask either Dave or Curtis, please plug them into the Q&A question. And again, before you drop off, feel free to register for the workshop. It is a complimentary session that you'll do with Dave and the team to see where you are on your SPM and your CPQ journey and all of that. I do see one question right now. It is directed for Dave. It's asking, what is driving companies and people to have these revenue transformation discussions?
Yeah, I mean, I think, not to cheat and use some of the content that, that our discussion that we already shared, but I do think, more and more, at least in the conversations I'm having, there's a recognition that it's not a calculation problem or just a calculation problem. It's, all of these things, as Curtis pointed out rightly, they're all connected, right? And so I think, if you think about, like, we've spent 25 years primarily solving that incentives problem, but now we have all of these other capabilities and all these things we can do to start solving the planning and analysis. So to me, Ola, that's it, right? Like, I think leaders are recognizing, like, okay, because it can be like, I'm not even on the roadmap yet, and I need to get on the roadmap. But a lot of conversations are like, I'm on the roadmap, I may be 2 steps in, what's next, right? So, like, wherever you are on that journey, there's an opportunity for us to come in and have that conversation. And I think that's what's sort of, that broadening of that aperture is really what's driving a lot of leaders to have that discussion.
Great, thank you. We have another question for Curtis. How many survey respondents are in the revenue operations category versus sales and sales op?
Oh, I love this.
You want me to nerd out on some data? That's okay. Whoever that is, love to chat more with you on this. But no, so we had 1,400 people respond to the survey. Of that, I think 150 or so were C-suite members. 622 of them were revenue leaders. And then I think close to 600 would fall in the sales and revenue operations bucket. Now we kind of had a little bit of overlap in a couple of those categories because we would call somebody who's a revenue operations leader or a sales operations leader, they're a revenue leader, right? So we kind of created some slices of data to look at these larger groupings of roles. But particularly for sales and rev ops, it was about 600 people that were in that part of the sample. And what I found kind of interesting about this, I wish we had more longitudinal data to kind of look at the evolution. But Dave, as you were talking kind of the evolution of these roles over time, right now, like the folks that identified in the survey, like about 200 or a little under 200 are classifying themselves as revenue operations leaders versus sales operations leaders. So about a third of that sample that fall into the sales or rev ops bucket are in revenue operations roles versus sales op roles. So I thought that was kind of an interesting, as teams are evolving, like that title, that role, that function, that again speaks symbolically and practically towards alignment across the revenue function. Like, that number is growing. And so I can't say it with data, and I'd be careful about what I say with data, what I don't say with data. But with this one, I would assume that number is growing from years previous and will continue to grow as the revenue aspect and the more encompassing aspect of those functions start to grow as well.
Well, I'm going to hold you to that, because we're going to do this again next year, and you're going to come back and tell us.
Great. I can't wait.
But I think just to add a little bit of my flavor to that too, like last year I did some research into like the CRO title and sort of how more common, and it was, I want to say there was numerous articles written about like how CRO was the fastest growing title, Ola, on LinkedIn. So for what it's worth, if you look at like titles on LinkedIn, there's a clear sort of trajectory in that direction where more and more the CRO role but corresponding the operations side of that coin, I assume revenue operations is following along. But we'll have Curtis come back and actually give us the real data next year.
I'll hold you to it. It'll be a lot of fun.
I'll get it scheduled from now. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Curtis. This was really, really great session. I appreciate you both for being here. If anybody has any additional questions, this is the chance. We've got 1 more minute before we wrap things up. All right. Seems like you've given the audience a lot to think about. Thanks again for your time, and have a wonderful day.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Take care.